Hello everyone, this is Bill Griffin. Welcome to the Different Take Podcast. Today I want to talk about something that has been promoted quite a bit in left-wing social media, television. The idea that the United States is a defective, immoral country, and as evidence they point to the Constitution, a clause known as the 3/5 Compromise in our history books. As evidence of them pointing, how they frame this is there's an article that I'd like to go over, and this is typical of many messages, as I said, that you hear throughout left-wing media by Marxists that are trying to promote a Marxist ideology and using race to do so. So here is a column that I'll read from called Tennessee Republican Defends Counting Black People as 3/5 of Human Beings. That's the headline. This is typical of a lot of messaging that you hear when they talk about the 3/5 compromise. So what is the 3/5 compromise? Well, there's a clause in the United States Constitution, Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3. I'll read from it. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all persons. So what does that mean? What does that mean? It has to do with counting people for the census to determine representation in the House of Representatives. The Constitutional Convention decided upon two House of Legislature, one the Senate, 2 senators from each state, and then the House of Representatives were decided based on what the Senate's census count came up with. The northern states were primarily did not have slavery. At that time, Pennsylvania had already abolished slavery, along with some other states. The southern states, in putting this fragile group together, they'd already tried once before, fought a war to gain independence, but in putting these states together, the northern states did not want the slaves in the southern states counted at all, whereas the southern states saw that would mean very small representation in the House of Representatives. So they're loggerheads, and according to what's commonly known as the Charles Pinckney of South Carolina proposed this compromise. So this was not an original ratio. It had been established in 1781 for the basis of taxation. This took some doing, but eventually they agreed on this, and nine of the 13 states had to ratify this in order for there to be adoption, is what the Constitutional Convention agreed upon. So to give you an idea of how this affected the slave states, 4 states that succeeded of the original 13 in 1861. So in 1790, when the census was done, according to that census, around 4 million people. Today, Maricopa County in Arizona has more people than the census counted in 1790. There were 105 total legislators in the House of Representatives, and 47 were from these 4 states. That there were other states that succeeded. There were 11 of them in 1863. As the states were added, there were slave states added. So the number from 1793 to 1863 went from 47 only to 61, while the total legislature went from 105 to 241. So these states went from 45% to 25%. So the idea that the United States was founded on a completely racist society that built their society and the great economic power that we have today all came from the fact that we had slavery. This is not, I don't think, very, very accurate. The South was an agrarian society, and as kind of pointing to that and what people thought of at the time in 1861 as war approached, William T. Sherman was general for the Union Army, and prior to the war, he was the superintendent at the Louisiana State Seminary of Learning, which is now Louisiana State University. He was at a some sort of gathering, and he was asked, this is 1860, and there's talk of war. And he was asked what he thought about it. And this is what he purportedly said. "You people of the South don't know what you are doing. This country will be drenched in blood, and God only knows how it will end. It is all folly, madness, a crime against civilization. You people speak so lightly of war. You don't know what you're talking about. War is a terrible thing. You mistake, too, the people of the North. They are a peaceable people, but an earnest people, and they will fight, too. They are not going to let this country be destroyed without a mighty effort to save it. Besides, where are your men and appliances of war to contend against them? The North can make a steam engine, locomotive, or railway car. Hardly a yard of cloth or pair of shoes can you make. You are rushing into war with one of the most powerful, ingeniously mechanical, and determined people on earth right at your doors. You are bound to fail." So I want to read from another person, notable person at the time, Sam Houston, the governor of Texas. So when the talk of succession came up in his state, he was adamantly opposed to it. He refused to take an oath to the Confederacy. And so this is what he said. "To secede from the Union and set up another government would cause war. If you go to war with the United States, you will never conquer her, as she has the money and the men. If she does not whip you by guns, powder, and steel, she will starve you to death. It will take the flower of the country, the young men." So the takeaway from both of these sentiments, and by the way, Sam Houston was deposed as governor, and I think he actually lost a son in the Civil War who fought with the Confederacy. The idea that with both these men, what they explain is not only the spirit of the North, that the political will is inclined to fight over keeping the Union together, knowing this meant that slavery the institution would be abolished. And so that's one thing. But the other thing that you got to understand is that I believe is that they knew the North had a far better economy, much more modern economy, and the South was struggling from an industrial standpoint. They were never going to be able to defeat the North. The South was gambling. The political leaders in the South were gambling and convinced their people to go along with this. But the leaders knew that their hope was that the North would just quit. But they whipped the people in a fury to go to war, and so they did, and they lost, of course, which is not surprising. In hindsight, it's pretty predictable. And both these two men obviously saw this coming. Well, we fast forward to today. Well, actually, before we get to today, I think it's important to note that, well, what does the Civil War have to do with the 3/5 compromise and so forth? As I said, the South was the much weaker of the two sides, and a lot of that had to do with their representation, and that's reflected, I should say, in the representation in Congress. So moving on to this article, the headline is Tennessee Republican Defends Counting Black People as 3/5 of Human Beings. This is a very deceptive headline. The idea that this person would defend counting black people as 3/5 of human beings is kind of ridiculous on its face, but that's not what the 3/5 compromise was about. It was about protecting the South from gaining too much power in Congress, which had the institution of slavery. So this headline is very deceptive, that also that the northern states, black people lived in free states. So you weren't counting black people, you were counting enslaved people. But this is written by Alex Bollinger, Wednesday, May 5th, 2021, in a website called LGBTQ Nation. And it goes on to say, Tennessee lawmaker has come under fire for saying that, that the 3/5 compromise, the constitutional provision that said that enslaved African people in the United States only count as 60% of a human being, was actually a good thing. Well, as opposed to counting them as one, as a whole person, yes. It would have been better to count them as 0. That would have been more favorable to the northern states and would reduce this power of the southern states even further. As I said, in 1863, Turner 41 legislators, 61 of those were from states that succeeded. It goes on. State Representative Justin Lafferty, the lawmaker that was making this speech, and he was arguing for a bill to limit funding to schools that taught systemic racism. The article goes on to say, Lafferty said that the 3/5 compromise was a bitter pill that actually limited the power of slave states. The 3/5 compromise was a direct effort, this is from Lafferty, quote, the 3/5 compromise was a direct effort to ensure that southern states never got the population necessary to continue the practice of slavery everywhere in the country. He goes on, the 3/5 compromise was a direct effort to ensure that southern states never got the population necessary to continue the practice of slavery everywhere in the country by limiting the number of population in the count, specifically limiting the number of representatives that would be available in the slave-holding states. And they did it for the purpose of ending slavery well before Abraham Lincoln, well before the Civil War, he continued. The columnist says, none of this is true. I don't know what he's talking about. Of course, it is true that the United States legislature took several actions to limit the spread of slavery. Pennsylvania abolished slavery in 1780, I'm not sure, but it was prior to the Constitutional Convention. There was a strong political will to, in many of the northern states, to limit slavery. They abhorred it. And to say that those people, those states did not take action. For example, the slave trade was stopped. The spread of states weren't admitted unless they outlawed slavery. The idea that wasn't done with the intent of ending slavery is ridiculous. Was everyone on board? No. But there clearly it was a direct effort by many people at the time to end slavery. So this columnist goes on, Alex Bollinger, I've never heard of him before, but this is typical of what you will read to defend this idea that the Three-Fifths Compromise is defective. He goes on, talking about Lafferty's explanation of history has a few issues, including that the Three-Fifths Compromise didn't limit the power of white people in slave states. If anything, it greatly unfairly expanded their vote, since enslaved people in those states weren't actually allowed to exercise their right to vote. So because enslaved people weren't allowed to this is funny, they didn't have a right to vote. They were in slavery. He says weren't actually allowed to exercise their right to vote. They didn't have a right to vote. But to think that since they are slaves and they're not voting, then counting them for the purpose of the census obviously would boost the number of legislators in the House of Representatives. I don't think this person that wrote this really knows what he's talking about. But at any rate, this is kind of typical. People will buy this kind of thing because it sounds so reprehensible to say, well, we're only going to count you as 3/5 of a person, so therefore you're subhuman. But that wasn't the purpose of this. It goes on. The white people in those states were given an extra 60% representation compared even to white Northerners. That just doesn't make any sense, because you're claiming that states like Pennsylvania should have not ratified and joined the United States. This was a fragile group of 13 colonies, states that were colonies and had just fought a war. The institution of slavery had been around for a long time. And of course, it didn't end slavery before the Civil War. That was one of the big reasons, probably the big reason, that the Civil War was fought. It goes on, the legacy of the Three-Fifths Compromise includes the horrific messages sent. The American government believed that black people were not full human beings. That is just blatantly false. The northern states had black people living there, and they were considered full human beings. And the idea that the people in the South, the slaves, were not considered full human beings is ridiculous, because they're just trying to limit the power that the South had. So, Tennessee State Representative Antonio Parkinson, Democrat, chairman of the Black Caucus in the Tennessee House of Representatives, is quoted, "I thought it was horrible," talking about Justin Lafferty's speech. "I don't care if it's policy or how you're counting heads. There's nothing good about slavery." This is a total lie. Who would get up and defend slavery? This man isn't doing that. He's actually defending the clause in the Constitution that prevented the slave states from getting power. So this article goes on about some other issues, but the point that I'm trying to make here is that this is what the media is doing. They even link a Twitter video link to a CNN, they link a CNN video where the headline is "GOP lawmaker under fire for praising Three-Fifths Compromise." There's a lot. The only thing that I can think of that they're trying to do here is to say states such as Pennsylvania should have said, nope, we're not doing it. We are going to go our own way, and we are not going to be a part of the United States of America. And that's, I think, would have been a horrible decision. They made a great decision. We have a great country that we live in. We don't have slavery, and the people in the North were willing to fight and die to prevent or to abolish slavery. And this is something that when these people talk about this compromise, they completely ignore this. Very deceptive, very dishonest. Something that I've recently read that I believe this is very pertinent. This is from The Madness of Crowds by Douglas Murray. He's an author and political commentator, a British fellow, by the way. He says, "We know ourselves to be better than people in history because we know how they behaved and we know that we would have behaved better. There is a gigantic modern fallacy at work here. For of course, people only think that they would have acted better in history because they know how history ended up. People in history didn't and don't have that luxury. They made good or bad choices in the times and places they were given the situations that they found themselves with." So I think this gentleman that wrote this, I'm assuming he's a gentleman, Alex Bollinger, he is, I don't even think he's thought this through, what he's saying, that, as I said, the northern states should have not joined the Union. That is the only thing that you can glean from this, if he understands. Otherwise, he doesn't understand this. And I don't think that's the case with the people that are really talking about this 3/5 thing, which I've heard for a few years now, off and on. So that is why I think when you look at history, you put yourselves in the shoes of those men, not the slave states, but the free states, the states that abolished slavery. You have to be thankful that they made the decisions they made, because that has made our country what it is. And instead, we have people are looking back and they cherry pick these little things and twist them to make them look into something that's much worse than it, or make it into something that it wasn't even intended to be to start with. Trying to create evil out of a moral, sensible decision. So it's really quite twisted, but that's what we see in our culture today. So that is the different take for today. I hope when you hear the term 3/5, when people are talking about that, they bring it up, and they will, and they have, that you'll realize that they either don't know what they're talking about or they're lying one way or the other. So I really appreciate your listening. You've been listening to Different Take Podcast. If you appreciate it, if you could check out our website, the platforms are on. And if you have any comments at all, I would like to hear them. Thank you.